Welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast about the craft of writing history. I'm your host, Kate Carpenter, and in today's episode, I interviewed not one, but three authors for the show: Robert Alpert, Merle Eisenberg, and Lee Mordechai.
Our pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Together, Robert, Merle, and Lee are the co-authors of a new book, Diseased Cinema: Plagues, Pandemics, and Zombies in American Movies. Robert Alpert is a lawyer and film scholar who teaches at Fordham University and has written extensively about film following his career as a practicing attorney. Merle Eisenberg is a historian of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages and is a professor at Oklahoma State University. Lee Mordechai is a historian of the Eastern Roman Empire and a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Together, Merle and Lee also host a podcast called Infectious Historians, all about the history of disease, pandemics, and medicine. I was eager to talk with all three about what it was like to write a book together, which even came with one more wrinkle. Robert and Merle are also father and son. Please enjoy my conversation with Robert Alpert, Merle Eisenberg, and Lee Mordechai.
My trajectory is probably a little different than my co-authors. I started out actually in law school and was bored as studying law at law school, and then I think it was my third year in law school, I decided I wanted to study film. So I went from NYU Law School to Columbia Film School and took both schools at the same time. I hated law school and then actually got out and actually loved the practice of law. So that's what I did for the next 30 plus years. And that's where I learned to write. But it was obviously different from my co-authors because my writing was really developed. Writing briefs, preparing for trials, depositions, appeal briefs, and so forth. And then about, 10 years or so ago, I retired from law and began writing for film journals. I would emphasize non-academic film journals. And that's really how I got my writing skills, to the extent I have any.
So I was thinking about this, and I think some of my background knowledge actually came from when I started writing opinion pieces for my college newspaper, the Colby Echo. And when I originally started writing things, I was writing about big topics of the day. This was back in 2004, 2005. So stuff like the Iraq War and the economics of the Iraq War. And someone said to me, we're all a bunch of college students. This is not resonating. And so I started writing about similar issues of economics, but about things that I think were more on topic. So I wrote a famous article about how they removed the full deli bar from the lunch at one of the cafeterias, which was based purely in a similar vein on economics. They wanted to save money rather than to give us choice and allow us to eat, in my case, a tuna fish sandwich every day. And so what I took from that and leading to my own academic work, I think, is a focus on simple writing, not a lot of jargon, very straightforward, and things that people can really grapple with and hold on to. And that doesn't mean that I don't love to read theory. And I think of the three of us, I'm the only one who actually likes to read theory. But at the very least, a focus on writing in such a way that it's accessible as possible and as simple as possible.
Yeah, and from my side, I would say that I learned to write at Princeton during grad school, but it was both the graduate program in the history department, but also collaborating with others, which is something I've done through my work in environmental history. And I think that once you try to work with others, it kind of forces you to write in a certain way, or teaches you, let's say, teaches you first, forces you later to write in a different way that is more accessible to others. You have to defend your ideas, I mean, in person or in writing, towards the people with whom you're writing. And I think that was an experience that helped me with this book as well.
When and where do you like to do your writing?
This is Robert, I always do it at my desk, and I have a sort of routine now. I get up in the morning, I have breakfast, read the news, and then I immediately go for an hour and a half walk. I come back, sit at my desk. I'm now in Vermont, and so my desk overlooks, the trees and whatever, and I sit there, work continuously, don't get up from my desk really, other than for maybe a cup of coffee, have lunch, and then go back at. So I work pretty consistently, as much as I can, right at my desk.
And I would say it's changed over the years. So I used to, before my kids were born, do my best writing from about 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning. And that's definitely not the case anymore, except there was a little return to that during COVID for obvious reasons. So I do the thing probably a lot of people do, which is write a few hours early in the morning and try to get things done that way. The one thing I've noticed is I'm still very much a hard copy person. So I print everything out, I revise everything by hand. And I'm also very good for targeted outcomes and deadlines, much more so than if I just, writing a bit here or there. So I think Lee probably remembers this, the first article we wrote together back when I was finishing my dissertation. We wrote, and I think, Lee, you can correct me if I'm wrong, about 5 or 6 weeks all told. And then we sent it to a few people and submitted it to a well-known journal. And so that was done in about 5 or 6 weeks. And I do the same thing now, which is I have about 2 more weeks. I'm in Princeton at the moment, and I want to get a chapter done. So it will be done next week, no matter what. And that spurs me and gets me going a lot more than just letting it drag on for however long.
Right. And Lee here, I also do mornings. I think it was way easier to do before kids. I think my dissertation was written in a year of 3 hours. 3 hours a day in the morning. It was like much easier to do that way than any other way I could think of. Having a daughter changed things a bit, but I think I can still squeeze in, let's say, an hour and a half, hopefully before she wakes up, but not always.
How do you all organize yourselves, especially kind of the sources you're working with? Are there tools that you use?
The answer is, since I write on movies, I largely, it sounds kind of strange, but I largely disregard sources. Sorry. And I completely immerse myself in the movies and formulate how, they work together and in terms of what the thesis is that I'm writing about. And then only once I've actually committed to electronic copy, I was going to say paper, but that's no longer the case. But once I've written that, then and only then do I start looking at sources. And that's when I flesh it out, add things, footnote things, refer to writers and so forth. But I only do that after I've come up with what I think are my ideas, my perspective on what I've written about.
I would say something similar. I still like hard copies of sources and those types of things in front of me spread out, even if I'll have multiple screens of other sources. And then in terms of organization, I'm a big fan of Zotero, which I think I had to teach Robert even what it was.
You did.
Yeah, but that's, very useful for organizing things, pulling in sources, those types of topics. But I would say over the years, I basically go through a cycle in which I consistently use Zotero, but that I go back and forth between where I write, how I do things in hard copy. I'd like to say I'm consistent, but I'm definitely not at all.
Yeah, so I also use Zotero, but more broadly, I match the tool I use or the tools I use to the project, right? So Zotero is great for organizing my own information or for collaborating, really. But in certain other projects, I could use other tools. For example, Google Sheets to organize everything more easily. So have, let's say, a line or like a row for each source that I use, and that allows me to compare or to overview these more easily than Zotero.
Part of the reason I was so excited to talk with you guys is that I wanted to hear more about your sort of co-writing, co-authorship process. As many listeners know, whether they're historians or not, historians often don't write together. And I know, Merle, you and Lee have been working together for a while. And then, Robert, you added a third voice to this project. So I want to know, first of all, just how did you decide to do this project together?
I'll start off, I guess, giving some background, and then I'll let probably Robert chime in with some specifics, which is Lee and I have published extensively on a 6th century pandemic called the Justinianic Plague, and pushing back on narratives of everyone dies and the world ends. Be very brief. But what we were interested in is why it seemed like everyone had that idea in the back of their mind. So we were trying to answer the question, something like, why do people today think about disease changing the world, right? Why do people think that disease comes in the past, kills everyone, and changes how people live? And what we realized is that was, like all history, didn't always exist from time immemorial, and that there was a change over time, and that it was very much a cultural change. And so it was very much how we think about things rather than how people necessarily read the sources any differently. And so we wanted to explore these cultural changes, which is very much a 20th and 21st century American story. And so we set out to explore this. And as I had watched a lot of films growing up, film seemed like the obvious category to explore this. And so we then approached Robert and asked him, would you like to write an article initially with us on disease films?
And since Merle asked me, no dad, at least this dad, can't turn down any of his children. If the child asks, can you help me write something? In fact, Merle from time to time had helped me and edited and commented on some of my film articles. And I, in turn, on occasion, actually commented on some of his history articles. So I obviously had to say yes. There's just no arguments. But I admit I didn't know very much about the area. I mean, I knew movies, but I had never thought of it as a kind of subgenre. And so the first thing I did was put together a list of about 50 movies. And it was hard because there are a lot more than 50 movies. And I had to make some decisions about how do you choose movies? American movies, foreign movies? Do I care if they're good movies? Can they be junk movies? So there are all kinds of criteria. But and how historically important are they? So I came up with that list, and we then began drafting an article. And this was, I guess, in December of 2018 when we first started it. And we drafted, as I say, and the article turned into about 23,000 words. You can see it kind of grew. And I remember the conversation in June. And it was Lee. I've never asked why Lee, not Merle. And anyway, Lee, I remember specifically said, would I be interested in writing a book? And my concern, actually, I remember, was, again, I couldn't turn my son down if he asked him to do something, but I was actually more concerned that why would he want to waste his time? They were both, Lee and Merle are both in academia. What's a movie book going to do for them in terms of their CV or whatever? And so I expressed concern that, this is going to take a lot of time to do. Do you really want to do this? And they both said yes. So that's kind of how we started down the road. We initially divided the article, 23,000 words, into 3 chapters, chronological chapters. I took the first one, Merle took the second chapter, and Lee took the third chapter. And each of us amplified it. Eventually, what happened was that we realized we obviously needed more chapters. Merle actually came up with some suggestions for the additional chapters. And I ended up doing we titled the remix chapter, Invasion of the Body Snatchers chapter. Merle ended up doing the franchise chapter. He was originally going to do The Walking Dead. I remember, and I was just dreading it. But fortunately, we obviously skipped that. And Lee ended up doing what turned out to be a really smart chapter, which was the COVID chapter. And he did an enormous amount of factual research that I don't know if you can even put it together the same way he did at the time. And then we kept going through it and revising it. I don't know if Lee, you want to chime in at this point about, how we progressed and what we did and how we edited it.
Yeah, I mean, COVID happened somewhere in the middle there, right? Or it was pretty early on. And I think that was a challenge for us. I mean, obviously because of COVID itself. I think, at least on my side, other things that changed at the time were me starting a new actual job and me having a baby. The fact that COVID happened gave us, I guess, more time in total, but also a sense of urgency and a sense of relevancy that was kind of absent early on. I mean, we realized, I think pretty early on, right? In February or so, late January, early February 2020, that this is going to be a big thing. We put out a piece in the Washington Post, kind of like talking about COVID and trying to comment on it from what we knew back then, from what we knew on both history and movies to an extent. And we just kept on writing and revising, especially revising in general, and especially perhaps the COVID chapter. I think the chronological chapters were easier. The two main controversial chapters or most revised chapters were the COVID one and the franchise one, right? So the Resident Evil one.
That was a nightmare chapter. I just want to just say.
What does revising as a group look like?
I'm happy to give an outline first, and then you can tell my co-authors have many stories they want to tell. But I'll give the factual background, as it were. Each of us, as Robert pointed out, started writing a particular chapter in Google Docs, which, given my father's age, I had to explain, I think, what Google Docs is and how to use it. So that was a unique challenge. So we started writing there. Everyone would go through and edit it in real time. One nice thing working with Lee that I've long learned is because he's typically, although not right now, in Israel, he has that 7-hour gap. And so if you write and edit, you get the edits back in the morning and vice versa. So you actually really go very, very fast because you're not working at the same speed. But so we wrote all the chapters in Google Docs. Then we found that there was a limit to how you could kind of see stuff in Google Docs, right? It's not a complete software system. So you pull it down into Word. We would then pass around edits back and forth, again, with the time lag being very helpful here. And then we would all print it out, or at least I would print it out and Robert would print it out. I'm not sure Lee does that. And edit by hand, type up the edits, and then do another round of sending around. So it's a long, complicated process in really 3 different media. And how much the editing was needed, how much was done, again, depended on the chapter.
One thing I would add is that we also did editing in real time. I mean, I do remember oftentimes we were most often on Skype. And I remember us actually editing on Skype while all 3 of us were on for literally hours. And I remember, Lee editing, and then I would re-edit Lee's and going back and forth. So it was a pretty intense process to try to get it so that it met all of our desires for what and how it would read.
Right. So there were 2 ways in which we did this. And I think, as Robert said, one was, after we all had our comments and we all essentially dumped our comments on one version, we had these marathon Skype sessions in which we would hash over things. So this was one version. The other version, I think, was to simply throw everything out and rewrite. And I think we rewrote the Nightmare chapter, the Resident Evil one, completely, probably 3 times, if I remember correctly. Yeah, and this was just out of frustration, as in one of us would read the current version and say, okay, this is too bad. I cannot deal with this. Let me rewrite the entire thing. It is so bad that I'm willing to rewrite the entire thing. And we actually did that 3 times because of this. So I think that the most heated arguments were around that, partially because I think we all agreed that the movies were bad, but we kind of disagreed about how bad and what could we actually do with them. So a lot of the debates, I think most of the energy overall went there. And if you compare that to the chronological chapters, I really think those did not have that many heated arguments, or even the Body Snatchers chapter, right? All the 4 of those were pretty straightforward. There may have been arguments, but they were nowhere as heated as the Resident Evil one.
I was just going to say, on a more positive note, that the really wonderful thing about writing with other people is when you write by yourself, you have a series of assumptions and ideas that you already know, and you don't connect the ideas. So I always like to think about it, you read a source, we'll call it A, and then you have a big idea, which is C, and you have a hard time filling in the B, which is kind of the boring analysis of the source to get to your big point. But when you write with someone else, when you don't do the B, they're like, what are you doing here? There's no analysis. You can't just quote a thing and then tell me, this is the most important thing since sliced bread. That back and forth, I think, is very helpful.
The difficulty, to turn to the difficult aspect of collaboration, is that when you have more than one, the upside is also the downside, and that's what makes it both fruitful and difficult. When you collaborate with someone else, whether it be one person, two persons, or however many, each person adds something, and as Merle said, there are assumptions that you make that other people make explicit. But the flip side of that is that you approach things very differently. And so that makes it very rough. I'm a film person. I'm also a literary person, fiction person. Lee is much more of a quantitative person, not immersed in film, certainly, and so has a very different approach. I look back, and we early on, I can't believe we did this. We actually did. Lee came up with a spreadsheet to try to quantify community in the movies, and which is both helpful and not, from my perspective. And so I think a lot of the dissonance was trying to understand Lee, and Lee trying to understand me. Merle was in a way, since he is my son, sort of, had some of me, and yet he also had some of Lee's thinking, because he'd worked with him so long. And so it made there were some rough moments, I think Lee and I had. I mean, thank God we got over them. And, there were changes that were made. I actually found out about one change that I didn't even know was going on in the invasion chapter, that apparently Lee and Merle were making changes and had gone on interminably. And I didn't even realize the changes had been made on something I had written. But as I say, the negative is also part of the positive. When you have somebody who's very different from you, it really upsets what you anticipate, what you assume, and so forth. But the good news is, as a result of that, you get a perspective that's different from yours and really enriches the writing as a consequence.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think that part of the challenge in this project for me was to figure out the methodology to use, right? Because this was like so out of field for me, right? I mean, what am I supposed to know, right? I'm a medievalist, like actually working on Byzantium, I mean, in the Middle Ages. I mean, what's the connection between that and film? Basically nothing. And I remember that early on, I tried to find some kind of literature that would help me understand this project in general, just as a model. And I could not find anything, right? So a lot of what we were discussing really were the ways to tackle this research question. I'll also add that as someone who's collaborated quite a lot, I think collaborating with two other people, right? So having a 3-person project was especially challenging because we all had inputs, we all wanted to contribute, and there was a lot of dialogue between the three of us, as opposed to having one person lead and kind of like the other two just like chime in or kind of add to what that one person was doing, right? So from my experience, when I write with one other person, it's usually a dialogue, but that's relatively easy to do. And when I write with, let's say, 4 more people, like in total, one person usually takes the lead and the others just make the changes, revise, but there's clearly one person lead. And I think that the 3-person dynamic was very different in the sense of having, like, I don't know, 3 co-authors in the full sense, as opposed to one lead author and many co-authors.
I'm very glad that you all can laugh about this process as we interview now. Did you get sick of each other? It sounds like you spent a lot of time working and thinking together.
There were...
Yeah, Robert, do you want...
I think Lee was a real gentleman. I just want to kudos to Lee. I do. I have to admit, I lost my cool on a couple of occasions. Lee, it's interesting. Lee, you would have been I don't think I've said this to you. You would have been a great lawyer. You were just argumentative, and it was great. But I wasn't used to it in the movie world, and certainly not in writing. But he was certainly a gentleman in terms of, acknowledging that we had our differences and, smoothing over those differences. And yes, we can laugh at it now, but there were there were some very tense moments. I at one point wondered if we were going to finish this book. But as I say, Lee, you were you were really wonderful when it came to understanding the difficulties of what we were encountering, all three of us ultimately.
Yeah, and thanks. I'll start by that. But it was really, I think, our commitment to the project in general that helped push us through, right? And here, really, I mean, I'll return the favor, right? And it was really Robert without whom this couldn't have worked, right? I mean, Merle and I could have wanted as much as possible, but I mean, we're not film people, and I mean, we kind of knew some of the films, but I mean, I at least knew nothing about theory. I mean, the conversations with Robert taught me a lot, even if they were heated at times. They still taught me a lot about how to watch films, how to think about them in all these different layers that I remember were all new to me. I guess for Merle, this was like part of his education, I guess. I don't know, as a kid in their family. But for me, it was not. So it was really informative to kind of have these conversations. And again, I'm kind of used to arguing. This is the tradition from which I'm coming. So it was less a big deal. And as again, because we were all committed to the project and we were all willing to eventually work through our differences, it was a very edifying experience for me to just like go through this entire process.
I want to ask about that family dynamic a little bit because I am curious what it's like to write with your dad or your child. Robert and Merle, what was that process like for you? Did it surprise you?
Yes, I'll start with that. But so, as I've taken to being the positive person, I guess, on this episode, it was really wonderful, right? I mean, how often do you get a chance to write with a family member in the course of the academy? I can think of a few other people off the top of my head who've done it much, much later in their career. And so, in that sense, I realized it was a once in a lifetime experience, for good or bad. And so I thought, this is something we're going to do and we're going to, get it done. And so I was really wonderful in that sense and really amazing to get it done. I'll say it was also interesting, and this is something we haven't touched upon, although I think it's obvious, even if obviously listeners can't see us, is my father is obviously much older than the two of us, which I'll give you two specific writing-based examples, is one, and this took me a long time to figure out, is that my dad's education stopped. I don't want to tell everyone exactly how old you are, but certainly before the cultural turn happens and before theory really is involved in much of the academy. And so, in a sense, how he watches and thinks about things is much more of a completely previous generation who then didn't learn about Foucault and didn't learn about the cultural turn and all these things I think we all take for granted in terms of how we write. And so his approach to writing was much different than ours. And it also showed up very interestingly enough, and to speak more positively of my father now, he was trained to write in a, old school grammar kind of way. And so in a way that, you and I, certainly myself, never learned English grammar in school anymore, the way in which he would write sentences was just actually fundamentally different in where he places his clauses and how he writes. And so we had to decide, do we do this very now I'll kind of age you, 60s-ish writing style, or do we update it in a more looser way? And so it was something I just never thought about or never considered, both of those two things.
No, I mean, I'll add that I think we kind of touched upon this earlier on, but Robert always seemed to reject like the over theorizing of the kind of content that we were working on, which is something that really resonated with me because I have my issues as well with this very dense type of writing. And I think it was Robert who kept pushing us towards simplifying and speaking to actual people as opposed to like 5 other people around the world, right? So the fact that we could speak to a wider audience is really something that Robert pushed.
Yeah, it was great. I unhesitatingly say that I loved working with Merle, and it was a privilege because when does a parent actually get to know their child as an adult and I don't mean, to watch from the outside, but actually to see them think and act in their profession as an adult. That's just never happens. And so I'm tremendously appreciative of that. And I hope, going back to something I said earlier, I hope that Lee and Merle didn't waste their time academically writing this book. About how I write, and I think that's probably the case. I'm not very much into theory, to put it mildly. I once had an article rejected by one of those academic journals. They said it was I was writing, I think, on Lubitsch, and they said, oh, it's over theorized, and they told me the book that I should have analyzed in the context. And I said, who wants to read that? So I've never been into theory for that reason. I also have a view that, at the end of the day, you want to be, dare I use the old term, humanistic. You want people to read what you write. That's why I write. I write because it's personal. It's very personal. I want to extend myself to the audience. If on occasion I acknowledge that I'm probably too into the minutiae of such thoughts, but at the end of the day, it's not about theory. I don't believe it's about connecting with your audience. I suppose, and now I'm going to kind of go out on a limb, I also have a view that I lived through that, Foucault and the early writings and later writings and so forth. And, I guess part of it is also a political stance on my part, which is I also think a lot of this is part and parcel of what we discuss in our book. But a lot of this theory just comes out of, it's like capitalist thinking in a way. We've lost touch. And I think that's part of what our book, I hope, is about, is that we've lost touch with a part of who we were. And that our system, emphasizes theory. There's a reason why. And that's why I don't write for academic journals, because, you're writing to 5 people, as was just pointed out. And you want to love what you're doing. You want to love the movies. You want people to love what you write, and you want to help people in reverse. And so I guess I'm old school, but that's that's pre-Reagan. And that's good. That's all to the good. Hippies should live forever. Sorry.
Fantastic. To talk a bit more about how the book came together, I asked the authors to read a section of the book and talk to me about it. In true collaborative fashion, here are Robert Alpert, Merle Eisenberg, and Lee Mordechai reading from the final chapter of Diseased Cinema.
COVID's outbreak and global spread played out like a movie script, and that similarity helped shape the public's perception of the pandemic. COVID slowly expanded from China to Iran to Europe to the United States, gradually resulting in the implementation of lockdowns to mitigate the disease's impact. From early on, international, national, and local media compared the developing COVID pandemic to movie diseases. Fictional narratives and reality blurred. Stills from movies were juxtaposed with photos from real events, such as runs on food at supermarkets or overburdened hospitals. Movies comparisons focused on film screen scenes which reflected COVID experience, such as self-isolation at home and deserted streets of a post-apocalyptic world.
Pandemic movies, particularly films from the mid-1990s onward, entered COVID-related discussions almost immediately. Film and real-life events reinforced one another. As early as January 23, 2020, the New York Post cited Contagion as the model for the development and spread of COVID. Likewise, the New York Times review of Outbreak appeared on the front page of its online version in March with the title, quote, "Now we're living the sequel," end quote. Perhaps less expected was the significant place of zombie movies in discussions. Commentators, for example, compare real Israel's closing of its borders with the walls fictional Israel raised around the country in World War Z. The media also featured a few references to older movies. An American baby boomer who was infected on the Diamond Princess cruise ship remarked that the doctors and nurses checking him on board while quarantined looked like something out of the Andromeda Strain. The Wall Street Journal even used the 70-year-old Panic in the Streets to describe the urban COVID experience. Given that these movies were less well known to audiences, though, they were unsurprisingly featured less often.
Movies helped their audiences understand the early, harsh lockdowns in many countries. These strict lockdowns led to the emptying of public spaces in urban centers, reminding observers of the end times. Stores closed, mass transit travel was reduced and car driving ceased almost entirely. Recalling scenes from earlier disease films, such as 12 Monkeys, some stories described how cities, suburbs, and towns appeared to turn into natural habitats with wild animals prowling the streets. The two films that featured commonly in comparisons to the present were Contagion and 28 Days Later. Each was used primarily in the country that produced it, the United States and the United Kingdom, respectively.
Merle and Lee, so you have a podcast called Infectious Historians, and I know this book was really shaped by some of those conversations and the research for that show. How have you seen the relationship between the podcast and the book?
I would say it's quite symbiotic. I mean, we started the podcast, if I recall, Lee. Lee refuses to listen to early episodes because he thinks they're so terribly edited.
I sympathize.
They are.
They are our most popular, though, Lee. But we started podcasting in March of 2020, which is when we really accelerated, I think, the book's chapters at that point. I think we had obviously started writing well before that, but accelerated at that point. And so I think these things combined together. We had a number of guests on whose work features throughout the book, whether it be for historical reasons or for movie reasons. I think we had someone on who wrote a really great article about Italian zombie films at some point early on because I wanted to talk to him about it. But what I would say, and we often talk to people about the podcast in this way, is, and I imagine you feel the same way, is you get basically an hour-long one-on-one seminar with someone on their topic after you have read their work. So you learn about a field or a subfield or whatever, a way of writing that you had no idea about. And then you get to talk to someone who's really smart about it, about their ideas. And so I think for this book, it was absolutely central. I mean, if you compare the podcast episodes with the endnotes for the chapters, you would see a one-to-one correspondence. And it's also, I think Lee and I have talked about this before, we both taught a course on the history of disease. So that work has spilled over into that and into our own research in other fields.
Right. I'll remind again that when we came to both actually podcasting, but also this film, I mean, I'll speak for myself. I had very little background as to all these other pandemics or all these other movies. And I think that the podcast allowed us to approach people, ask them to contribute, just like come on. And I think that was, Merle, you could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember this being way easier to do early on. And when everyone was kind of like sitting at home, having nothing to do, then a bunch of, I think, Merle, were you a graduate student at the beginning? I think you were a postdoc already? Yeah, both of us were postdocs. No, I actually started my job. So, but we were like very early career people, kind of like unknowns to the entire field. So when two random people emailed you out of the blue in the beginning of COVID, so actually quite a few people said yes. I would say actually everyone said yes other than our friends who kind of refused to do this. But it was a great way to enter a field and understand what was going on. And we had both the hour-long conversations that were eventually aired, but especially early on, we all had quite a bit of time on our hands. So we tended to stay and speak off the record with some of the people, some of our guests. And that was also very useful to kind of get less formal answers as to what was going on and kind of like bounce back and forth some ideas.
Yeah, just to quickly add, I mean, you're a historian of science, and Lee and I guess, are technically historians of science, but without any formal training, even though we're from the same department and we should have taken all the courses with all the people you obviously took courses with. And so a lot of the stuff we had to learn on our own. But then when people would come on the podcast, we could basically get a mini lesson in, a seminar that we should have taken in grad school from a whole bunch of people.
You've all hinted at this, but I really want to underscore that you started really talking about this book in 2019, and then COVID sort of interrupted, altered the trajectory. I think it's not uncommon for historians, especially 20th century historians, to be writing about things that are still very much sort of ongoing. But you guys were living this subject in a way that few other people do. How did that change the way you approached this book or the way you thought about it?
I'm going to say that in a way, COVID accelerated us in writing the book. And as I think Merle said earlier, it gave us impetus to, not only hurriedly write it, but also try to get it published. But as I'm thinking back, I'm not sure, speaking for myself, I'm not sure it really changed the book in terms of the book's thesis. I think what it did, at least for me, is it illustrated exactly what we were saying in the book, how ideology oftentimes drives what's supposed to be objective science, and how politics oftentimes is responsible for how we approach diseases. So while it exemplified it, I'm not sure it changed my thinking in terms of the book itself and how we approach the different movies that we talked about in the book. It certainly it made possible the chapter on COVID, but the chapter on COVID, to my way of thinking, is an illustration of what the movies are already saying. So it becomes a real life example of it.
What I would add is if we peel back the layers of when we wrote the book, we accelerated the process, I think Robert just pointed out. And I don't think the book was quite ready or there yet. And so then we took a step back and kept doing more work. And Lee, to his credit, thought about the COVID chapter very early on. But if Lee recalls, the COVID chapter itself went through, probably 30 mini drafts, right? Because we're literally writing about an ongoing thing. And I think we thought that there would be significant changes in American thought, society, whatever you want to talk about, through COVID. And actually, when we finally finished the book, it was at probably the best moment, which was effectively everywhere in the world ending all lockdowns, right? Because I think right as we finished the draft, China had just said, whatever, we're done, and lifted it overnight. So we had a Chinese paragraph. We had to change the whole Chinese paragraph, literally, I think, in the last bit. But by that point, what you realized, as Robert said, is that we had all these intermediary drafts, which would be actually interesting to pull up in retrospect, where we thought things would be different. We thought there might be changes, this and that. But in the end, I think, we arrived at a somewhat, at least in that chapter, depressing conclusion that not much had changed, whether or not it was, Donald Trump in the White House or Joe Biden in the White House, for example.
Right. And I think COVID was a good case study to observe as we wrote the book. And to me, it also demonstrated how what we were saying was actually an important addition to the conversation, because COVID did not actually work as movies such as Contagion predicted it would, right? So yes, there were superficial differences, but this entire idea of movies portraying us all as equal and having us all like having the same, I don't know, chance of dying from a disease, that was very clearly unrealistic. And it was pretty obvious early on, I mean, for us working on this, and yet was not really part of the conversation surrounding these movies, especially in the first half or so of 2020, when these movies featured pretty significantly in discussions.
We've talked a fair amount already about how this book is quite interdisciplinary, and for all of you, it sort of stretched the bounds of what you normally think and write about. I wanted to know, though, in addition to the challenges that can come from trying to fill those sorts of gaps in knowledge, were there surprises to you about combining those different perspectives and interdisciplinary approaches?
I mean, for me, I would say yes, right? As a historian, I remember some of the early discussions, and also not so early discussions, were me trying to grapple with this idea of kind of defining our really own corpus of movies, right? I mean, how Robert kind of alluded to this early on. There was, and some people might argue there still is, no such genre as a disease movie genre, right? So how do you actually decide which movies to include in the film and which not to include in the film? Now, as a medievalist, I'm used to working with anything I could find, right? So I just like put everything together, kind of try to read everything and work that way. With movies, I mean, this was obviously not realistic to do. And then there's the question of why are we choosing movie A and not movie B? And how do we justify that to ourselves first, but also our audience? So this was something I clearly learned, this different approach of just putting things together that you thought are important, putting them together and kind of working through that self-defined corpus, which might be easier for other historians who work on, let's say, 20th century stuff, in which you obviously cannot cover everything, but were unusual to me?
For me, the difference in this was um, my background is as a under Andrew Saris was as an auteurist. That's how I've always approached movies. Just how I was trained, I guess. But as times passed, I've also been influenced by other writers, especially someone like Robin Wood, who's not only auteurist but also politically oriented. So the difficulty I had with the book was I view it as an art form film, and this is more a cultural historian approach. And so it was difficult to, how shall I put it, stomach some of these movies. I mean, watching Resident Evil was just, oh my God. But having to do that because it actually is significant culturally in terms of what it says about us, or having, I remember we talked about the Dawn of the Dead, the remake, which I thought is just horrific. And actually, I think Lee, unless I'm mistaken, chime in if I'm wrong, I think Lee actually liked it. So, uh, it was for me to try to peg movies in terms of cultural and historic changes was a struggle, certainly. So that is the one way I would say, when at one point one of our readers suggested we needed early movies from the 30s. So I had to ignore who the directors of all these movies were and just plunge into a half dozen movies so that I could get the cultural sense of them. So that was my struggle, is just use them as, I guess, to use the quantitative notion, use them as data. And that I struggled with, but I had Merle, I had Leah's helping me. I mean, that was part of our arguments. How do you approach movies?
I'll just quickly add that one thing I think is useful for me having gone through this process, and it's something that as likely a medieval historian I always think with, is doing a deep dive on one source and doing it really well was something that this book allowed me to return to, because we decided, I think correctly, to focus on a few important examples of films and then also give alternative visions. And so thinking about centering certain actors, certain people to really give a voice to what you want to do rather than just trying to do everything, which is a temptation, I think, for historians, right? If you're a 20th century historian, so you have a million sources, right? But you do have to start picking things and people, even as you want to show, oh, I've read everything, right? And thus I want to talk about everything, right? But actually, as most of us go through, I think, our careers, we realize that doing a better job on one or two things is often much better. And so I think this allowed me in my own work that I do on medieval history to start going back to that a lot more now and not feel so worried that, oh, I don't have 9,000 sources and I don't cite everything, right? Just tell the story you want to tell and say, oh, there are all alternatives. Here are some alternatives, and just know that you know your stuff.
Well, as we wrap up here, I want to turn and ask a little bit about sources of inspiration. Who are other writers or perhaps other media that you each look to for inspiration?
Again, I'm a movie person. So I look to movies. I mean, I'm watching movies every day without stop. So, it depends on the day. I mean, I was just noting, I watched Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia the other day, and, Richard Lester's Marion and Robin. So it's, the range of things that I watch are pretty broad in terms of writers. I tend to read, I guess, what my co-authors would say are kind of classical, old school people, and I still do. I mean, I'm reading a Richard Ford novel now simply because I get immersed in his sense of the kind of daily details of just staying alive and what that means. But I tend toward writers who I think just don't write simple sentences, who write poetically, and so I binge on them, like Ishiguro, Alice Munro, Philip Roth. Merle knows that I'm a deeply immersed in George Eliot. I'm reading Montaigne's essays now, all classical writers, because they write wonderfully, and that's part of, as a reader, that's what inspires me. Human, people who write, so I connect with them. That's, I think, the beauty of writing. You can actually, reach out I'm going to use the stupid, reach out and touch somebody phrase, stupid phrase. I can't believe I was going to do that. But you connect with it, and it's true of all art. I mean, I also collect art, and art is similar visually. If you can connect with some great Rembrandt etchings or paintings, that to me is the source of great inspiration, a commonality with the people who are writing or who are painting, who are drawing, whatever. At the end of the day, that's what it's about, is the sense of great writing and connection.
So I'll stick with the history genre for the moment. One thing I did many years ago in grad school is I went to all my friends in completely different subfields and I said, can you give me a top 10 list of things I should read, right, for whatever reason? And so I worked my way through books in that manner more than anything else, rather than in my own field. I mean, I like medieval history. I'm a medieval historian. But, reading in your own field just gets kind of after a while. And so, I look to other inspirations, as Lee has probably heard me go on about 19 or 20 times at this point. Mario Canada's Straight State, for example, is my go-to example of the best structured book I've ever seen put together. So books like that is where I really get inspiration from, something that makes me think a little differently outside the confines of the questions that are in my field over and over again, as well as more interesting and different ways of writing. So actually, my co-authors would probably be interested to know that I've actually almost finished now Colson Whitehead's Zone 1, which is a zombie novel. It's the first zombie plague thing that I've read. Yeah, they're laughing at me because I think all of us are so sick of anything disease zombie related that we can't watch anything. And it's true. And someone told me about this as we were finishing the book. And I said, absolutely not. I'm not reading this. And I got a cheap copy. And so I've actually been reading through it. And it's just fantastic because it's very human driven, very simple writing, very straightforward. So it's the first zombie thing. So I'd recommend to both Robert and Lee that they both read it, actually. And it's a very good read.
Yeah, might be part of a sequel of our book. But no, my my inspiration, I mean, is clearly not in the discipline of history. It is also clearly not in some kind of classical writing. So, I mean, I would probably go with online writing, right? So online long form writing, as in long articles in which a person, usually a random person that I don't know, in some blog or something, manages to convey an idea that I had not thought of before in an attractive and fluent way. That has been, let's say, over the past 5 years or so, that has been a source of inspiration for me of how to write and how to connect with broad and unknown audiences, which I think are different from how I thought of audience in my grad school days or within my small limited field.
What's the best piece of writing advice each of you has received?
Yeah, I can go first here. It's pretty simple. It's just write every day and things add up, right? So writing, like, let's say a page or two every day, kind of struggling with it, even if it's bad, just like put something on paper, adds up very quickly to chapters and more articles. And then, yes, obviously you have to revise stuff, but you at least have like a big lump of text that you can work with, which is, at least from my perspective, far more useful than having everything in your head, because you start losing things from your head like very quickly. This is my experience. So yeah, just like putting that stuff out there, saving it somewhere, and returning and revising many times if necessary. But it's still like the easiest way of moving quickly and getting stuff done, for me at least.
The one piece of advice that's stuck with me, and I don't know if it's the best piece, but it is clearly as I say, it has really stuck with me in terms of how I approach writing, which is Samson Rafelson. When I wrote for him, we had to write a treatment for a screenplay, and I wrote something extraordinarily personal. I'm not going to repeat it here. It was so personal. And I was clearly troubled by the events that I wrote about. As I say, it was intended to be a treatment for a screenplay. And we turned it in. And in class, he looked at me and said, when you write, he said, you can't write too rawly. You have to, what he was clearly getting at is it has to be poetically filtered. And I guess in a way that's both good and bad in terms of how I approach writing. It's both personal and yet it can't be too personal because it has to connect.
So probably one of the similar moments to Robert that I had was I wrote what's now a part of a book chapter, but an early form in a dissertation on this guy Cesario Savaro, who's a bishop of southern France. And I gave the chapter to Bill Jordan, William Chester Jordan, the now emeritus but great medievalist at Princeton. And Bill, as he's wont to do, had edited the whole thing by hand with pencil, ripped it apart in terms of the writing, and, basically said to me, I'm paraphrasing now, something like, you clearly don't like this guy, and you think he's, I don't think Bill would ever curse, but in my words, he's a pain in the butt. And I said, yeah, the guy sucks. And he said, that might be the case, but you have to have empathy with everyone and all of your actors, because it doesn't explain by just saying this person sucks. You have to try to understand them on their own terms and have empathy with whatever their situation is. You might condemn them for their actions, and that's perfectly reasonable, but to try to understand why they made the decisions they did in their own time period and how they thought is really the approach.
Before I let you all go, can I ask you what you're working on these days? Is there another collaboration in the works? Are you also traumatized by collaboration?
The answer is we're not. I don't know if it's a tempting thought or not. But to answer directly your question, actually, I've completed a manuscript and editing a book that I actually had started before we began this book on disease, and now only many years later returned to. It's a book called Robots, or tentatively titled Robots and Computers in American Movies, the AI Myth. It's, as the title would indicate, it's about movies about artificial intelligence and robots and what that says about us, both culturally, but also, as to use my word, ontologically, how we define ourselves.
Yeah, so for me, I just submitted the manuscript about the 6th century environmental event, right? A dust veil event or some kind of atmospheric event that happened in the 6th century, which turned a particular year, 536 CE, to be considered the worst year to be alive by both some historians and broader public discussion. So it's really an intellectual history of how we move from essentially important, which is not very important in the sources, to something that is extremely dramatic in 21st century readings. So it's really focusing on the past 40 years and seeing how interdisciplinary discussions have moved the interpretation of that particular historical event in unexpected ways, let's say.
So I should say, for my penance, I have read both of their manuscripts and given both of them detailed feedback on both manuscripts. So I still work with them, I suppose. Whether or not, especially my father, listens to any of the things I gave him as feedback is an open question. For myself, I am doing 2 book manuscripts at the moment. One is a revision of my dissertation, finally, after getting sidetracked for obvious reasons on diseases and plagues for the last 5 years. And so that's about halfway or 2/3 of the way done. So I hope to finish that in the fall. And that's on basically the fall reactions to the fall of the Roman Empire and what's now southern France. And then Lee and I, probably sooner rather than later, will also finally write our book on the 6th century pandemic, the Justinianic plague, since we published on that a lot. And both of us, I think, want to have one last thing to say and then probably never touch disease and plague again if we can help it. Although I'm sure people will ask us to write articles in the years to come and we'll say, but we'll probably do it anyways because I know how this works.
Fantastic. Well, Robert Alpert, Lee Mordechai, and Merle Eisenberg, thank you so much for joining me on Drafting the Past.
Thanks.
You.
It was a
We can't even successfully say thank you collaboratively.
I'll take the pause and say thanks for having us.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of Drafting the Past. Visit draftingthepast.com to find show notes with links to all of the books we talked about, as well as a complete transcript of the episode. Please tell a friend about the show and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you'd like to help keep Drafting the Past going, you can always support the show at patreon.com/draftingthepast. Until next time, happy writing.